Before the war, before the speeches carved into marble, before any of what we think we know about him, there was a gentle, fatalistic man who could not bring himself to hate anyone, and a country that would test that to its very foundations. This is not, mostly, a story about deeds. It is a story about a temperament, one quiet quality, held under the heaviest pressure a man can be put under. So settle in and let it unfold slowly. We are going to spend a long while inside the life of Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 2: The Boy Who Would Not Shoot. His earliest memory was of a thing the world simply took back. He was a small boy in the hills of Kentucky, and one day he and his father dropped pumpkin seeds into the furrowed rows of the Knob Creek cornfield. That weekend, a rain came down off the hills, and it washed the whole planting away, every seed, down the slope and gone. Before he could read, before he could even quite say it, he had learned a thing that would stay with him his whole life, that the work a man does and the outcome he gets do not always belong to each other. Some of it the world keeps, and some of it the world does as it pleases with. Just before his 8th birthday, the family was newly settled across the Ohio in Indiana, in a rough cabin in the woods, and a flock of wild turkeys came up close. Through a crack in the logs, the boy raised a rifle and fired, and he killed one of them. And then, something happened that no one could ever quite explain, himself least of all. He never, in his whole life, pulled a trigger on any larger living thing again. Whatever it was he felt, standing over that bird in the winter brush, it never left him. It is the first thing we know about him that is truly his own, and it is the thing this entire story turns on: the boy who would not shoot. An axe was put into his hands at about 8 years old, and for the next 15 years he was almost never without it. He grew fast and tall and thin, spidery, tired all the time. His father hired him out to the neighbors, plowing, splitting rails, slaughtering hogs. And by the law of the time, every wage the boy earned belonged to his father, and he had to hand it over. The father was a plain, plodding, unlettered man who could barely sign his own name, and in everything Lincoln ever wrote about him afterward, there is not one warm word. He could not love him. And he would spend the whole rest of his life quietly, deliberately, refusing to become him. When he was 9, the deaths began, and for a while they did not stop. A sickness was moving through the settlement, milk sickness. A slow poison passed through the milk of cows that had eaten a certain wild plant in the woods. It was killing the neighbors all around them, the people they knew, family by family, and that autumn it reached into his own cabin and took his mother, Nancy. She was about 34 years old. His father built the coffin himself, out of green wood, fastened it together with wooden pegs whittled by hand, and the boy helped him do it, and they carried her up a wooded hill and buried her. For most of the year that followed, the children were half wild and half cared for, more or less raising themselves. His older sister Sarah, not yet 12, kept what house there was and would sit by the fire and cry. One biographer, looking out across all the hard years of this very hard life, thought that this one may well have been the hardest of them all. And a few years on, that same sister Sarah would die in childbirth at 19 and be buried with her stillborn child. The losses simply kept coming, and the boy simply kept enduring them. A year of that went by, and then his father went back to Kentucky and came home with a widow named Sarah Bush. She walked into a filthy, half-feral house, and the first thing she did was take those grieving, neglected children and have them soaped and rubbed and washed clean. She brought a little furniture and bedding, and the one thing the house had been missing entirely, which was the simple, ordinary gift of love. He called her, for the rest of his days, the best friend he ever had. She, for her part, said she had known the moment she met him that he would grow up to be a great man. The generosity he would one day be famous for giving away, he was given it first, right here. All the formal schooling he ever got, he later said, did not add up to 1 full year, so he taught himself the only way he could. He borrowed every book for 50 miles in any direction and read it by firelight, late into the night, after the work was done. A Life of Washington, the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Shakespeare. He worked his sums on a flat wooden board, scraped it clean with a knife, and worked them again. And in one of those sum books, in a child's hand, he wrote a little rhyme about himself. Abraham Lincoln, his hand and pen, he will be good, but God knows when. A boy already, somehow, somewhere else, though where, he could not yet have told you. Chapter 3. A Piece of Floating Driftwood. In 1831, when he was 22, a flatboat he was helping to steer down the Sangamon River caught on the mill dam at a little village called New Salem and hung there over the edge, slowly filling and beginning to sink. The whole village, about 100 people, came down to the bank to watch, and Lincoln did a plain, clever thing. He bored a hole in the bow to let the water out, tipped the boat forward, drained it, and floated it free. They were impressed enough that when he drifted back through some months later, they simply took him in. He would describe himself, in exactly that season of his life, as a piece of floating driftwood. The pure chance of where a boat happened to catch had quietly decided where the rest of his life would happen. He clerked in a store there, and within a year, the store had failed. But that was not the name that stuck to him. The name that stuck was Honest Abe. It came from small things, and that is exactly why it lasted. He was known to walk miles on a dark road after closing time to return a few cents he had accidentally overcharged a customer, and to weigh out goods to the exact ounce, no more and no less, because anything else would have been a kind of lie. He had almost nothing in those years. No money, no station, no name his father had given him worth having. The plainness was real, and the plainness was the whole of his capital. When the Black Hawk War broke out, his neighbors elected him captain of their volunteer company, a thing that, he said, gave him more pleasure than almost anything since. He saw no real fighting. He joked, ever after, that his only bloody struggles in that war had been with the mosquitoes. But one day, an old Indian man wandered into the camp carrying a letter of safe passage, and the soldiers, with their blood up, wanted to kill him on the spot. Lincoln stepped into the middle of it. He put his own body between the old man and his own man, and he held there, and the man lived. It is the turkey again, grown larger, the same gentleness, now standing between an enemy and a crowd of armed men who wanted him dead. He went on assembling himself, piece by piece, out of whatever he could reach. He walked 6 miles to borrow a grammar book and read it straight through. He read Shakespeare whole nights by the fire. He taught himself the law out of borrowed volumes, reading under a tree with his long legs up the trunk. Years later, when someone asked him who his teachers had been, who had guided this rise of his, he gave the plainest possible answer. He had studied, he said, with nobody. It was not a boast. If anything, it was the opposite. The quiet statement of a man who had built himself out of borrowed books because there had been no one to build him. And then the grief found him a second time. There was a young woman in New Salem named Anne Rutledge, with whom he had reached an understanding, an agreement to wait and then to marry. She caught a fever, and at 22, she died. He fell so far, so fast, that his friends grew frightened and quietly went around taking the knives and the razors out of his reach. The thing he could not bear, he told them, the thing that broke him over and over, was the thought of the rain beating down on her grave out in the open prairie. Many years and a whole life later, he still said it simply, without embellishment, that he had truly loved the girl, and that he thought of her, often, even now. By now, he was in the state legislature, and in 1837, the legislature did a thing that tells you where the country was. It voted 77-6 to formally condemn the abolitionists who wanted slavery ended. Against that overwhelming tide, 2 men, and only 2, filed a written protest into the record. One of them was a young Abraham Lincoln. Slavery, their protest said plainly, is founded on both injustice and bad policy. It changed nothing at all. It was 2 voices against the 77, and it sank without a ripple. But he meant it, all the way down. He could not remember a time, he would say years later, when he had not so thought and felt. And then he nearly went under entirely. He had asked Mary Todd to marry him, and then, on the 1st of January, 1841, a date he afterward called, simply, the fatal first, he broke the engagement off and broke down with it. I am now, he wrote to a friend, the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Once more, the knives were quietly taken away. He told another friend that he must either die or be better. He was 31 years old, and grief and despair had now come close to ending him twice. The melancholy was not a passing mood. It was the ground he stood on. The one time in his whole life he came near to fighting a duel, it was over some anonymous letters mocking a political rival. Letters he had written, and Mary Todd had helped him write. The man he mocked challenged him, and Lincoln, given the choice of weapons, chose cavalry broadswords to make the most of his long arms. They actually crossed the river to a sandbar to do it, and only at the last moment did friends manage to broker a peace and call the whole thing off. For the rest of his life, he could not stand to have it mentioned. He called it the meanest thing he ever did, and what shamed him was not the danger of the swords. It was that he, the man who preached cold, calculating reason as the answer to everything, had let himself, just once, be ruled by his own turbulent emotions. He never let it happen again. Chapter 4. The Long Plateau. He married Mary Todd on a few hours' notice in November of 1842, looking, one friend said, like a man going to the slaughter. Inside her wedding ring, he had engraved 3 words: "Love is eternal." A week after the wedding, he wrote that his own marrying was, to him, a matter of profound wonder. The marriage that followed has been read 100 different ways. On one side, there are the stories of her temper, the stick of firewood thrown in anger, the chasing him through the house. On the other, there is her fierce loyalty and her plain pride in him. His heart, she said, is as large as his arms are long. The truest thing about it is probably the hardest thing to hold, which is that both of those were always there at the same time. Twice a year, for years on end, he rode the circuit. 11,000 square miles of open prairie, county courthouse to county courthouse, a tired horse and a saddlebag, sleeping two to a tavern bed with Judge Davis and the other lawyers. He kept his papers, his notes, his whole disorganized practice in the tall stovepipe hat on his head. When you can't find a thing anywhere else, he told a colleague once, look in this. It was a settled, comfortable, dusty kind of life, full of company and small cases and long roads. And the quiet truth underneath it was that some real part of him was going slowly to waste inside it, year after year, and he half knew it and did not yet know what to do about it. As a lawyer, in those years, he had no fixed philosophy about the largest question of his age. He was a case lawyer. He took the work that came. In one case, he won a black woman her freedom, arguing the high principle that every person was free, without regard to color. And then, a few years later, in another case, he stood up in court for a slaveholder's claimed right to recover the people he called his property, and he lost. His business, one of his biographers wrote, flatly, was law and not morality. The conviction was in him the whole time. We have already heard him put it on the record. It had simply not yet been asked to cost him anything. It was waiting, like the rest of him, for the thing that would call it up. In the little cottage at 8th and Jackson, their second son, Eddie, fell ill. He stayed ill for 52 days, a slow consumption, wasting him by inches while the two parents watched, helpless. And then, not quite 4 years old, he died. They had buried a child now. By the time it was over, the lost current of his life ran long and unbroken. His mother in that pegged coffin in Indiana. His sister Sarah, dead in childbirth at 19. Anne Rutledge, under the prairie rain. And now this small boy in the cottage. This was a different kind of grief from the ones before, though. It did not arrive all at once, like the fever that took Anne, or the sickness that took his mother. It was the slow kind, the kind that does not announce itself afterward at all. It simply settles down into a house, and into a marriage, and into a man, very quietly. And it does not announce when it intends to leave, because it does not intend to leave. It stays there, for good, and it would not be the last small bed he stood beside. In 1851, his father lay dying, a half-day's ride away. Lincoln did not go to him. He did not go to the funeral, either. He sent only a short, cold note, and he blamed his absence on his wife being unwell. Hope that next to everything else we are going to see. This is the man who would one day forgive the rivals who had publicly mocked and scorn him, who would beg his cabinet to treat the defeated enemy gently, with no persecution, no bloody work, and that same man could not, or would not, ride half a day to sit beside his own father at the end of his life. The magnanimity in him was vast. It was real and it was vast, but it was not unlimited. And here is its edge, and he never once explained it. On those long circuit nights, after the other lawyers had gone to bed, he worked his way by candlelight through the geometry of Euclid, for no reason at all, except that it pleased him to follow a thing through to its proof. He was at the very head of his profession, and quietly, deeply bored by it. When he was asked, around this time, to write a few lines about himself for a short biography, this is the most that he could manage to say: "There is not much of it. There is not much of me." His public career, he had decided, was apparently over. He was a settled, middling, successful man of middle age, with a great hidden engine in him, idling and going nowhere. And he was waiting, without knowing it, for something he could not name. Chapter 5. The cold engine catches fire. And then, in 1854, a single new law reached into that idling life and woke the engine up. The law was the work of his old rival, Stephen Douglas, and it reopened the whole question of slavery. It tore up a solemn compromise, more than 30 years old, and let the institution spread into vast Western territory that had been closed to it for a generation. "It took us by surprise," Lincoln said afterward. "It astounded us. We were thunderstruck and stunned. It roused him," a friend wrote, "as he had never in his life been roused before." The bored, comfortable circuit lawyer, the man who had decided his public career was apparently over, was suddenly, completely, and finally awake. He began to study the question as he had never studied anything, and at dawn one morning, writing with a colleague, he put it as plainly as a man can put a thing. "I tell you," he said, "this nation cannot go on existing, half slave and half free." Everything he had been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting, had arrived at last. That autumn, at Peoria, he stood up and spoke for 3 full hours, and for the first time the whole of him was in it. He hated the spread of slavery, he said, because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself, because it made hypocrites of a people who called themselves free. "No man," he said, "is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent." And then in the very same speech came the honest limit of him, and you must hear it too. He did not know, he admitted, how you could free 4 million people and make them, all at once, the full political and social equals of everyone around them. He was a man of deep and genuine conviction, and a man of his own century's blindness, both, and he was honest enough to stand up and show you both in a single breath. A few months later, he came within a handful of votes of the United States Senate. He led on the very first ballot, and then he watched it slip. And at the decisive moment, to keep a pro-slavery man out of the seat, he gathered up every one of his own loyal votes and handed them, all of them, to a rival who had only a few of his own. That rival took the seat Lincoln himself had wanted for 20 years. "A less good-humored man than I," he said afterward, perhaps would not have consented to it. He gave the thing away with a smile and went home with nothing in his hands but the cause he had saved. It is the captain stepping in front of the old man again. The same gentleness, only this time it cost him the one thing he wanted most. Around this time, alone, he wrote out a private memorandum that he showed to no one, a raw, unguarded comparison of himself to his great rival, Stephen Douglas. With me, he wrote, the race of ambition has been a failure, a flat failure. With him, it has been one of splendid success. It is about as naked as ambition ever lets itself sound. And then, in the very next breath, the same little memo turns itself completely inside out. What he wanted, it turns out, was not the crown for its own sake. He wanted to reach a height so reached, he wrote, that the oppressed of my species might have shared with me in the elevation. By his late 40s, you could no longer tell his hunger apart from his conscience. Somewhere along the way, quietly, the two of them had become the same thing. When his closest friends read the draft of his next great speech, they were alarmed, and they begged him to cut its most dangerous line, the line that said a house divided against itself cannot stand, that this government could not go on forever, half slave and half free. It was, they told him, too radical. It would frighten people. It might cost him everything. He heard them out, and he refused. I think the time has come to say it, he told them, and I will let it go as it is. Here is a thing to understand about his famous caution. It was a method, not the whole of him. The patient, careful, lawyerly man had a place inside him, past which he would not bend for anyone. And by now he had found exactly where it was. And there's a Lincoln here that it would be far easier to leave out, and we are not going to leave him out. At Charleston, down in southern Illinois, on hostile ground and under real pressure, he opened a debate by disclaiming any wish whatsoever for the social and political equality of the white and black races. No black voters, he said. No black jurors, no intermarriage. Historians have argued ever since about what that was. Was it the genuine prejudice of a man of his century, or the cold calculation of a politician standing on dangerous ground? The honest answer, the one the record actually supports, is that it was almost certainly both at once. He was not a saint. He was a real man, inching forward in public towards something he could not yet fully see. Through that whole autumn, he and Douglas debated 7 times, 3 hours at a stretch, in town after prairie town. Douglas traveled like a prince in a private railroad car, with a brass cannon mounted on a flat car behind it to fire and announce his arrival. Lincoln rode the ordinary trains, with a single carpet bag, exceptionally tall, painfully thin, with a high, piercing voice that carried over the crowds. He was not really trying to win the argument of any given afternoon. He was trying to move something far slower and far deeper than that. Public sentiment is everything, he said. He who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes. Change what the people in their hearts believe, and the laws will follow in their own time. That was always his patience. That was always his method. He lost. Walking home through the rain on that wet election night, his foot slipped on the muddy hogback path, and he caught himself just in time and steadied. It's a slip, he said to the man beside him, "and not a fall." In the days after, he was gloomy as midnight. "I expect everybody to desert me." And yet, in those very same days, he could also write this: "I am glad I made the late race." The cause of civil liberty must not be surrendered at the end of one or even 100 defeats. That was the whole shape of him in a single defeated week. The despair and the endurance, the slip and the catch were never very far apart in this man. They never would be. In the winter of 1860, he came east to New York and bought himself a $100 suit, the finest suit of clothes he had ever owned in his life. And then he was so afraid of failing in front of those cultivated Eastern men that he could hardly make himself leave his hotel room. And then he stood up at Cooper Union, and for an hour and a half, he laid out the case so plainly, so carefully, so completely, that the whole hall was simply his. He closed with this: "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." The piece of floating driftwood had come a very long way by then, and the strange human truth of it is that he still, even now, did not quite believe that it had. Chapter 6. Mary, Mary, we are elected. The day after he was elected president, before the sun had even gone down, Abraham Lincoln sat down and wrote 7 names on a card. They were, very nearly, the cabinet he would actually build. And the remarkable thing about that list is that most of the men on it were the very men who had wanted his job, who had run against him, who thought themselves plainly better than him and made little secret of it. "We needed the strongest men of the party," he said simply. "I had no right to deprive the country of their services." When somebody warned him that one of these men believed himself far larger than the president, Lincoln only laughed. "Do you know," he said, "of any other men who think they are bigger than I am? I want to put them all in my cabinet. It is the boy who would not shoot, and the captain who stepped in front of the old man, except now the gentleness is going to run a government." Years before any of this, in a courtroom in Cincinnati, a brilliant, arrogant Eastern lawyer named Edwin Stanton had taken one look at the gangling Westerner who had been sent to help with the case and asked, in a whisper meant to be heard, why on earth they had brought that long-armed ape. "A man," he said, "who knew nothing at all." Lincoln heard every word of it. He was shut out of the meals and the meetings, his careful brief ignored, and he went home burning with the humiliation of it. And then, when he came to need the hardest, ablest, most relentless man in the whole country to run his War Department, he gave the job to Stanton. He simply did not, he explained, remember the past against people. It cost him nothing, he found, that he was not perfectly glad to pay. On a cold February morning in 1861, he stood on the back platform of a train at the little Springfield depot with the snow blowing around him, and he found he could hardly speak. He had lived in that town for 24 years. One of his children was buried there. "I now leave," he managed to say, "with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. Without the assistance of that divine being who attended him, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail." And the crowd in the cold called back to him, "We will do it." The train pulled out into the snow. he never saw the town again. His very first crisis as president was a single fort in a single harbor, slowly running out of food. He could not simply abandon it, and he would not, for anything, fire the first shot of a civil war. So he did the smallest possible thing that a man in his place could do. He sent food. He told the South, openly, that he was sending food and nothing more. And then he waited. The Confederates fired on the fort. They attacked Sumter, he said quietly afterward, and thus did more service than it otherwise could. And when, in the confusion of those first days, a mix-up sent the wrong warship to the wrong place and fouled the whole operation, he did not look around for someone to blame. He took the entire blame onto himself. That first winter of the war nearly broke him in two. There was no money in the treasury, and no general anywhere who would move his army. And the army's own commander was flat on his back with typhoid fever. And the whole vast impatient country was turning every single day to look at him. The people are impatient, he wrote to a friend. The bottom is out of the tub. What shall I do? And there was no one above him to ask. Think of what that meant for this particular man, the one who had felt his whole life that he was being carried along by forces far larger than himself, was now, suddenly, the largest force there was, and there was nothing at all under his feet. And then, in the very middle of all of it, the war came home to him. His son Willie, 11 years old, the brightest and most beloved of his children, caught typhoid fever from the White House's own foul drinking water, and he died. "Well, Nicolay," Lincoln said to his secretary, "my boy is gone. He is actually gone." And then he wept. He shut himself away alone and was heard reading aloud, over and over, a single line from an old play. "If that be true, I shall see my boy again." Mary never once entered the room where Willie had died. Not ever again. And something in Lincoln himself went very quiet after that, and it stayed quiet, and it turned, somehow, in the dark of that grief, gentler. Chapter 7. Events have controlled me. He found the whole thing, to the end of his days, genuinely astonishing. To a visitor in the White House, he once said it as plainly as it can be said. "Doesn't it strike you as queer," he asked, "that I, who couldn't cut the head off of a chicken and who is sick at the sight of blood, should be cast into the middle of a great war?" There it is, in his own voice, the thing this whole life is about. The gentlest man that anyone around him had ever known was presiding over the bloodiest war his country had ever fought, and he never, ever got over the strangeness of it. He did not pretend, even once, that the two halves of that fit together. He simply carried them, both, every single day, all the way to the end. Alone, in that same stretch, he wrote down a thought he meant for no one ever to read. Both sides in this war, he reasoned on the page, prayed to the very same God. Both of them could not be answered. And so, perhaps, God's purpose in all of it was something different from the purpose of either of them. God wills this contest, he wrote, and wills that it shall not end yet. It was not a politician's note, and it was not written to console him. It was a man, entirely alone, trying to find the floor of something that had no floor, and finding there, instead of a policy or a plan, only a kind of vast, and awful patience. The fatalism of the frontier boy was quietly becoming something more like faith. He had spent his whole life inching toward this, and never once leaping. He drafted the great proclamation in secret, a line or two at a time, over weeks, in the quiet telegraph office of the War Department, where the wires came in. He had the thing fully written before he ever showed it to his cabinet, and he showed it to them not to ask their permission, but simply to tell them what he meant to do. "I put the draft aside," he said, "as you do your sketch for a picture, waiting for a victory." Even now, even here, he still half believed the freed people might one day have to leave the country. He was a man of his century right to the end of it, and we will not pretend otherwise. But when the moment finally came, on the first day of 1863, he signed it. "I never," he said, "in my life, felt more certain that I was doing right." The victory he had been waiting for came at Antietam, and it came at a cost almost beyond imagining. It was the bloodiest single day the country had ever seen, before or since. Roughly 6,000 men dead between sunrise and dark, on one field in one day. But to Lincoln, that terrible day was not only a battle. He told his cabinet, haltingly, that he had made a kind of vow, a covenant, he said, hesitating a little over the word, to himself and to his Maker, that if the army held and the enemy was driven back, he would take it as a sign that he was meant to act. The dreadful day was the sign. By now he could no longer separate the killing from the will of God, and he had quietly stopped trying. That same hard winter, far off in Minnesota, hundreds of Dakota men were sentenced to hang after a brutal and bloody uprising, 303 of them condemned to death together. And here Lincoln did a thing that no one had asked him to do, and that no one would have faulted him for skipping. He sat down and read the records himself, case by case by case, looking for the line between an act of war and an act of murder. He crossed off 264 of the names. 38 men were hanged that December at Mankato, still, to this day, the largest public execution in American history. And when a senator told him plainly that more hangings would mean more votes for him in that state, Lincoln answered, "I could not afford to hang men for votes. It is the very hardest thing to hold about him." The same hand that saved 264 lives signed 38 death warrants. Both of them were his. He never once pretended otherwise. And then the strangest grief of all, the one that is hardest to square with the men who would not shoot. After the great Union victory at Gettysburg, the beaten enemy army stood trapped against a flooded river, unable to cross, and the Union general let it slip away in the night. Lincoln, the man who could not bring himself to cut the head off a chicken, was beside himself with anguish over it. He wrote a letter he could not bring himself to send. He was within your easy grasp. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am distressed immeasurably. Sit with that. Here is the gentlest man in the whole country, sick at heart that the killing had not gone far enough, because he understood, with terrible clarity, that every soldier who escaped that river meant the whole bloody business would simply have to be done all over again. By now, the tenderness and the awful arithmetic were running side by side in him, and neither one was letting go. Not all of it was grief, though. In the worst stretch of that same winter, His own cabinet very nearly tore itself to pieces, one faction demanding he fire Seward, Seward himself resigning over it, Chase quietly intriguing against them both. And Lincoln, who had by then survived a very great deal worse than mere office politics, maneuvered the whole tangle around until he was holding the resignation letters of both his rival men at the same moment, and then he calmly kept them both. "Yes," he told a friend, patting the breast of his coat, "I can ride on now. I've got a pumpkin in each end of my bag." A man who had buried a mother, a sister, and now 2 sons. A man who knew exactly how little of his own life had ever truly been his to steer, was simply not a man you could rattle by disliking him. By the 3rd year of the war, he was 2 men at once, and he knew it perfectly well. In the very same months that he was calling for 500,000 more soldiers to feed into the fighting, he was pardoning deserters by the dozen, one after another, trying, as he put it, to evade the butchering business lately. He rode out to the army at City Point, and he passed a field full of the wounded, and he could not look away from them, and he could not stop the tears coming. "Look yonder at those poor fellows," he said. "I cannot bear it. This suffering, this loss of life, it is dreadful." The boy who would not fire on a living thing was now the man signing the orders that fed the slaughter and weeping at what those orders did. He carried both of those every day, right to the end. He never put either one down. When the Confederates raided right up to the very edge of Washington, Lincoln rode out to the fortifications and climbed up onto the parapet in his long frock coat and his tall plug hat to watch the fighting. And a man was shot down not far from where he stood. In a pigeonhole in his desk back at the White House, he kept more than 80 letters threatening to kill him. "I know I am in danger," he said, simply, when someone raised it. The plain truth was that he had stopped somewhere along the road, being afraid. A man who has come to believe that events have controlled him his whole life long does not, in the end, flinch very much at a bullet. He had made a kind of peace with the shape of his own fate, and it had left him, strangely, calmly, unafraid. Chapter 8. With Malice Toward None. In the autumn of 1864, the country did a thing no nation on earth had ever done before. It held a free and ordinary election in the very middle of its own civil war, and it returned him to office, and he took no triumph at all from it. "I am in favor," he said, "of short statutes of limitations in politics, meaning, let the bitterness of the campaign run out quickly, let it expire. Do not carry the grudges of it forward into the peace." He had just won the hardest political fight of his life, and his very first instinct, on winning it, was to forgive the winning, to let the anger of it go, and to ask everyone around him to let it go too. Salmon Chase had schemed for the presidency from inside Lincoln's own cabinet for years, had openly tried to take his place, had resigned at last in a sulk. And when the very highest seat in all of American law fell vacant, the office of Chief Justice, Lincoln gave it to him. "I should despise myself," he said, "if I allowed personal differences to affect my judgment of his fitness for the office." And there is a quiet grace note to it, far down the line. From that high bench, the very man Lincoln had forgiven would one day admit the first black attorney ever to argue a case before the Supreme Court of the United States, undoing, just a little, the worst single ruling that court had ever handed down. And then the thing he had been inching toward for 30 long years became, at last, permanent. The proclamation had been a war measure, and a war measure could one day be undone. An amendment to the Constitution itself could not. He lobbied for it personally, leaning on wavering men. "I am President of the United States," he reminded one of them, clothed with great power. And when the House finally passed it, by just 2 votes more than it needed, the guns of the city fired 100 rounds in celebration over Washington. He signed it the next day, and he called it, with a quiet and weary satisfaction, a king's cure for all the evils. That lonely written protest of 1837, 2 voices against 77, had finally, after a lifetime, become the law of the land. His generosity, by the end, ran out past the place where even his own cabinet could follow him. As the war drew toward its close, he drafted a plan to give the South $400 million, an enormous sum, a staggering sum, to ease the cost of freeing the slaves and to begin binding up the country's wounds before they had a chance to harden over into permanent scars. He brought it to his cabinet, and every single member of that cabinet told him no. He looked slowly around the table at all of them, and he said, almost wondering at it, "You are all against me." And then he quietly put the paper away. He had wanted, at the end of the bloodiest war in his country's history, to pay his own enemies' debts for them. The men around him thought it was madness. It was the most extravagant act of mercy he ever proposed, and he proposed it entirely alone. And then, in the 703rd word of the gentlest and the gravest thing he ever wrote, the 2 halves of him finally became a single sentence. He would not soften the cost of it, even now. Every drop of blood drawn by the lash, he said, might yet be paid by another drawn with a sword. And in the very same breath came the mercy, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. The fatalist and the man who could not hate were by now, at last, the same man. They say the sun broke through the gray clouds over the Capitol just as he rose to speak. This is what he actually looked like by then. He was a little alarmed about himself. He admitted to an old friend. His hand had gone cold and clammy. His face had aged a full decade in just 4 years. He was some 40 pounds lighter than the man who had come east in a $100 suit, and the people who saw him in those last weeks said he looked already half gone, worn nearly translucent by grief and by war, and yet, somehow, strangely and deeply at peace. A few weeks after that, the Confederate capital itself fell. The city that had been the heart of the rebellion for 4 long years, and Lincoln walked straight into Richmond with his young son's hand in his, and almost no guard at all, only a small handful of Marines down streets still smoking from the fires, where the windows of the defeated stayed shut and shuddered against him. The freed people, though, knew him on sight. They came pouring out of the houses and the alleys and the side streets toward him, calling out, weeping, and some of them fell to their knees in front of him right there in the rubble. "Don't kneel to me," he told them, lifting them up. "That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy. He could have entered that city as a conqueror, in triumph, with an army at his back. He entered it almost alone, on foot, and spent his strength telling freed slaves to stand up off their knees. And then, to the admiral walking beside him, he said only this, very quietly, "Thank God I have lived to see this. The nightmare is gone." His last speech was not about victory at all. It was about how to put a broken country gently back together. "We shall sooner have the fowl," he said, in his plain way, by hatching the egg than by smashing it. And inside that speech, he said a thing that no American president had ever said in public before him, that he would like to see at least some black men, the soldiers who had fought, the educated, given the vote. By his own careful, cautious standards, it was an enormous leap. Down in the crowd below the balcony, a young actor turned to the friend beside him and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make." Even at the very end, the patient man was still inching forward, and this time, the inch he took was the one that cost him his life. In his last days, he was gentle and worn and almost translucent. At his final cabinet meeting, he asked for no persecution, no bloody work. "Enough lives," he said, "have been sacrificed. We must extinguish our resentments." And he told the men around the table about a dream he kept having, again and again. He was aboard a strange, swift ship, gliding steadily over the water towards some far, indefinite shore. He had dreamt it, he said, before every great turning point of the war. On his very last afternoon, he rode out alone with Mary in an open carriage and said to her, "Of all the long, heavy years behind them, we have both been very miserable. We must both be more cheerful in the future." He had stopped somewhere along the way, being afraid of where the ship was carrying him. That night, at the theater, it ended, quickly, and without his ever knowing that it had. He was carried across the street and laid down diagonally across a bed that was far too short for his long frame, and there, in the gray of the next morning, he died, having never once woken. The hard, brilliant man who had years before called him a long-armed ape stood at the foot of that bed and said the only thing that could possibly have fit the moment. Now he belongs to the ages. The man who had stopped being afraid of the indefinite shore had quietly, at last, reached it. It was never, really, about the speeches, or the war, or even the freeing of 4 million people, though of course it was about all of those things. In the end, it was about a gentle, fatalistic man who, given more reasons to hate than almost anyone in his country's whole history, simply would not do it. The boy who would not fire on a living thing became the president who could not, when it was finally all over, find any malice in himself toward anyone at all. Not the rivals who had scorned him, not the enemy that had tried to destroy everything he loved. He never once believed that his life had been his own to drive. And perhaps that is exactly why he held it so lightly in his hands and gave so much of it away to others. The same gentleness that began with one turkey seen through a crack in a cabin wall ended in the gravest mercy a nation has ever received from one of its own.